the idea that I'm free if you take away bad things is clearly at best a half-truth. If you take away the bad things, I still need the good things. If you take away the occupying army, I'm still going to need a school. If you take somebody out of prison, they still need to have a way to get a job. It's pretty obvious that negative freedom only matters because of positive freedom. So then you have to ask historically, where did this come from and why is it so commonsensical? And where it comes from is as an idea of freedom as domination, essentially. So most of the time when the people in what I consider to be my own tradition are talking about freedom, they're talking about a freedom which is enabled by the domination of others, in particular slaves. So the way that I become free in this tradition is that I have a number of women at my beck and call, and I have serfs or slaves who are doing the work. And in that constellation, I have an estate, or I have a plantation, or in some larger sense, I'm part of an empire. And that allows me to be free. But of course, it doesn't allow anyone else to be free. But then why is that a notion of freedom? How does that function? Well, it functions, so to speak, academically because we screen out the slaves and the women. And we just have this picture of this kind of contextless person, and we see him as a hero of freedom. But the way that it works in our own minds is that we fantasize about being that person without thinking about the domination that was necessary to be that person, and therefore we don't think about like what would be positive, what would we need to have positive freedom, which involves actually seeing the position of the women or the position of the slaves, understanding that position, imagine the overall setting in which they could be free, which is possible. That's the thing. I mean, the beautiful thing about arguing about ideas is that you realize that the idea actually traps you in a past that you don't have to be in. We don't have to be in a world of negative freedom. It doesn't have to be the case that people who talk about freedom have to be regarded as heroes who we worship. It could be the case that many more people could be free, but we have to recognize the tradition, break out of it, or talk about freedom differently. Many of the apparent contradictions that we use to talk our way out of freedom are not real. Freedom and security is one example. The individual and society, in my view, is another example. Our whole English language conversation is built around a tragic clash between the individual and society. A lot of our culture is too. If you think of, instead of Bildungsromane, we have Hollywood movies where you have to go out and rebel against something, and the rebellion is the thing itself. And the hero is usually a lonely hero. So we have built in this notion that there's a tragic clash between the individual and society, where the society is holding the individual back. And of course that can happen, but that clash isn't at all necessary. On the contrary, in order to become the kind of individual who can be free, you already need a certain kind of society around you. So if I'm going to grow up to be a rebel, that means I have my own values that I'm rebelling in the name of. Where did I get those values? Or how did I even become a person who could consider values and choose among them and take risks for them? I can only do that because of parents, friends, caretakers, a whole set of networks around me. And where in turn does that come from? Those things have to already be there. There have to be formal and informal relationships, including political relationships, which enable that. So in a modern society, in order to raise a child to be free, we have to have that thing which we call the welfare state. Parents have to have vacation, they have to have parental leave, there has to be accessible childcare, schooling, all these things. So all these things which we mark over here as society are actually necessary in order to create that free individual. And so this is by way of thinking about what kind of society you would need to have positive freedom. You would need a welfare state, but one which is justified in completely different terms, in terms of freedom rather than in terms of solidarity or justice. It can also be justified in those ways, but I think mainly in terms of freedom. But emotionally, it's admittedly a much more empathetic society, because in order to see freedom this way, I have to understand that I need your freedom for my freedom. And that not just in a declarative sense or like some kind of nicey nice sense, but that it's actually true that in order for me to be free, there have to be institutions and practices that work for everybody. that's just a brute fact. It's not about being, nice or like trying to be generous. It's just true that if they're going to be good roads, they're going to be good roads for you as well as for me. If there's going to be a healthcare system, it's going to work for everybody involved, and so on and so forth. But also empathic in another sense, and this goes also to how negative freedom works. Negative freedom only makes sense when you don't understand yourself at all. And you can kind of see this in the heroes of negative freedom who are out there in the real world. You can have incredibly rich and successful people who tell us that freedom is just a matter of destroying the government, but they don't seem to be particularly self-aware, or for that matter, even happy people. And I think that's a natural result of thinking of freedom as being different from other people, cut off from other people, separate, isolated, in a special category. Whereas to be free, in fact, you have to know yourself, because without knowing yourself, you don't really know what situation you're in, you don't really know what choices you're making. And then in order to know yourself, you have to listen to somebody else. And you won't really listen to somebody else unless you believe empathically that they are in fact another human being the same way that you are. And so again, empathy turns out not to be something like, let's just be very nice because it's nice to be nice. But empathy turns out to be a precondition to having freedom.